My name is Daniel, and for most of my life, I believed that if I worked hard enough, I could earn my parents' love and approval. I thought that if I just achieved enough, they'd finally see me, not just as their son, but as someone they could be proud of. But life has a way of teaching you harsh truths, and for me, that lesson came wrapped in a bitter realization. I was never going to be enough for them. Growing up, it wasn't hard to see the favoritism in my family. My younger sister, Emily, was the golden child. She always had been. I was 3 years older than her, but from the time she could walk, she commanded all the attention in the room. It wasn't that I resented her. I loved my sister, but the disparity in how we were treated was impossible to ignore. I remember one year vividly. I was 10, and Emily was 7. For my birthday, my parents bought me a store-bought cake and had a small dinner at home with just the immediate family. It wasn't much, but I was happy with it. 2 months later, when Emily's birthday rolled around, they threw her a party with a bouncy castle, face painters, and even a petting zoo. The whole neighborhood showed up. Watching from the sidelines, I felt invisible. It wasn't just the party. It was the way they beamed at her, the way they showered her with praise. I wondered if I'd ever get that kind of attention. As we got older, the differences became more pronounced. Emily always had the newest toys, the best clothes, and all of my parents' attention. I had to save up my allowance for months just to buy a second-hand bike when I was 10. Emily saw it and threw a fit because she wanted one too. Instead of explaining to her that she needed to wait or earn it like I did, my parents went out the next day and bought her a brand new, more expensive bike. I can still remember how they handed it to her with pride, while I stood there feeling like I didn't matter. Academics were another area where favoritism shone through. I worked my ass off in school. I joined the math club, got straight A's, and even won a regional science fair in middle school. But my achievements barely registered with my parents. The only reaction I ever got was a quick, "That's nice, Daniel," before the conversation shifted back to Emily. Meanwhile, when she brought home a B+ in her weakest subject, they took her out for a celebratory dinner and bought her a new phone as a reward for her hard work. I tried not to let it get to me. I told myself that if I kept pushing, if I kept achieving, one day they'd notice. In high school, I became the captain of the debate team and the editor of the school newspaper. I maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA while juggling extracurriculars. I did everything I could to make them proud, but no matter what I did, it was never enough. When I was selected to participate in a prestigious summer program at Harvard during my junior year, I thought for sure they'd finally be impressed. It was a huge honor. Only 2 students from my school were chosen. I came home bursting with excitement, ready to share the news. We sat down for dinner, and I told them everything. My dad barely looked up from his plate. "That's good," he mumbled, "but don't let it go to your head." My mom added, "Just remember us when you're off becoming a big shot." That was it. No congratulations, no pride, just more of the same indifference. Emily, on the other hand, had a dance recital that same week. My parents couldn't stop talking about it. They couldn't make it to the airport to see me off to Harvard because her performance was the same day. Instead, I had to ask my friend's parents to give me a ride. It hurt more than I wanted to admit, but by then, I was used to being second. The college application process was another painful reminder of where I stood in their eyes. I poured months into perfecting my essays, preparing for SATs, and applying to top schools. When I received acceptance letters from several elite universities, including a substantial scholarship to my dream college, I thought maybe this would be the moment they'd finally be proud of me. I told them the news at dinner, my heart pounding with anticipation. My dad barely reacted. "Good for you," he said, before changing the subject to Emily's latest plans. Meanwhile, Emily barely scraped through high school. She decided not to go to college, and my parents praised her for knowing herself and not succumbing to societal pressure. They even bought her a car as a graduation gift. By the time I graduated from college with honors and landed a good job in finance, I had learned to stop expecting anything from them. I bought my first house at 27, completely on my own. I should have been proud of myself, and I was, but a part of me still wished my parents would acknowledge my accomplishments. Then came the event that changed everything. My grandfather on my dad's side passed away. He had been a self-made man, building a successful business from the ground up. His passing was hard on all of us, but I always felt a special connection to him. He was the only one in the family who ever seemed to notice my efforts. I didn't know it at the time, but he had been keeping a scrapbook of all my achievements, newspaper clippings, academic honors, everything. When his will was read, we learnt that he had divided his estate equally among his grandchildren, including me and Emily. My share came out to roughly $500,000, a life-changing amount that would allow me to pay off my student loans and invest in my future. I was stunned and incredibly grateful. It felt like, for the first time, someone in my family truly saw my worth, but my parents didn't see it that way. They pulled me aside after the reading of the will, their faces tight with frustration. "Daniel," my dad said, "we need to talk." I already knew where this was going. I could see it in their eyes. "We think it's unfair that you're getting an equal share," my mom added. "Emily needs the money more. She's struggling right now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My grandfather's decision was clear. He wanted all his grandchildren to be treated equally, but my parents were already trying to rewrite his wishes to benefit their favorite child. "Emily lives in your basement and works part-time at a coffee shop," I pointed out. "She's not even trying to improve her situation." "That's not the point," my dad snapped. "She needs support, and you're doing fine on your own. You should be willing to help your sister." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Grandpa made his decision. It's not up to us to change it." Their faces hardened. "If you were a good son, you'd do the right thing," my mom said. It was a familiar refrain, one I'd heard my whole life, but for the first time, I wasn't willing to play along. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not giving up my inheritance." The room went silent. I could feel the weight of their disappointment pressing down on me, but I stood my ground. I had spent my whole life trying to earn their love and approval, but this time, I was choosing myself. After that conversation with my parents, I tried to push my frustrations aside and focus on building my own life. At 28, I had a solid career in finance, a small but cozy home, and a group of friends who had become my chosen family. But no matter how much I accomplished, there was always that lingering sense of not being enough in my parents' eyes. Amy, on the other hand, continued to coast through life. She worked part-time at a coffee shop, lived rent-free in my parents' basement, and always seemed to have her needs taken care of. I stopped comparing myself to her a long time ago, but it was hard not to notice the stark difference in how we were treated. I figured it would never change, so I distanced myself emotionally. Then, the unexpected happened. My grandfather passed away. Grandpa was the one person in my family who always made me feel seen. He wasn't the warmest or most expressive man, but he took pride in hard work and integrity. He was a self-made businessman, having built a successful company from the ground up. I admired him deeply for that. We weren't particularly close, but he always made an effort to acknowledge my achievements. Unlike my parents, he never dismissed my success as insignificant. His passing hit me harder than I expected. At the funeral, I kept my distance from Amy and my parents. I didn't want to engage in their drama or deal with the thinly veiled tension that always lingered in the air when we were together. A few weeks after the funeral, my dad called me. "We need to talk about Grandpa's will," he said, his tone serious. I assumed it would be a straightforward conversation about the estate's distribution. Grandpa had several grandchildren and children, and I figured everything would be divided equally. What I didn't expect was the bombshell that followed. My grandfather had left a significant inheritance to each of his grandchildren, including me and Amy. The amount was substantial, enough to pay off my student loans, invest in my future, and even consider starting my own business. For the first time in my life, it felt like a door to real financial freedom had opened, but my parents weren't happy. During that phone call, my dad's tone shifted. "We need to discuss what you're going to do with your share," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Look," he continued, "Amy needs the money more than you do. She's struggling. She doesn't have the same opportunities you've had." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were already angling to take my inheritance and give it to Amy. "She works part-time by choice," I pointed out. "She's had the same opportunities. She just made different choices." My dad sighed, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "It's not about that. It's about doing what's right for the family." There it was, the familiar guilt trip I'd grown up with. For years, I'd been made to feel like my needs and accomplishments were secondary to Amy's. But this time, I wasn't a kid anymore. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me. "Grandpa made his decision," I said firmly. "He wanted us to have equal shares. I'm not giving mine away." That conversation marked the beginning of a battle I wasn't prepared for. My parents started calling me daily, trying to wear me down. They accused me of being selfish, of not caring about the family, of turning my back on my sister. They brought up every instance where they'd helped me in the past, paying for braces, buying school supplies, letting me live at home during college, as if those basic parental responsibilities gave them the right to take what was rightfully mine. One evening, my dad showed up at my house unannounced. He stood on my doorstep with a folder of documents. "Grandpa would have wanted this money to go to Amy," he said, thrusting the folder toward me. "What is this?" I asked, taking the folder reluctantly. "Proof," he said. "Proof that we're doing what he would have wanted." I opened the folder to find a letter my dad had written, claiming that Grandpa had expressed concerns about Amy's future and would have wanted her to have more financial support. It wasn't signed or dated, and it was clearly fabricated. "This isn't legal," I said, shaking my head. "You can't just rewrite the will." My dad's face turned red. "We're doing what's best for the family." "No," I said, my voice steady. "You're doing what's best for Amy. There's a difference." That night, I called my grandmother, Grandpa's widow. I hadn't spoken to her much since the funeral, but I needed clarity. I told her what my parents were trying to do. She was furious. "Your grandfather would be rolling in his grave if he knew what they were trying to pull," she said. "He made his wishes clear. He wanted all of you to be treated equally." Grandma didn't just stop at expressing her anger. She took action. She contacted the other executor of the will, the family lawyer, and Grandpa's other children, my aunts and uncles. Within days, the entire family knew what my parents were trying to do. My dad's siblings were outraged. They backed me up completely, insisting that the will be carried out as Grandpa intended. My parents were cornered, and they knew it, but they didn't back down easily. My dad accused me of turning the family against him. My mother cried on the phone, saying I was tearing the family apart. They twisted the narrative, painting me as the villain who was prioritizing money over family bonds. I wasn't buying it. For the first time in my life, I stood firm. I wasn't going to let them guilt me into giving up what was rightfully mine. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval, and I was done. This was my turning point, the moment I chose myself. What I didn't expect was the fallout that followed. After that conversation with my parents, things spiraled quickly. They weren't used to me standing my ground, and it threw them off balance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the compliant son who quietly accepted their decisions. Instead, I was asserting myself, and they didn't like it one bit. A few days after the will was read, my dad called me. His voice was cold, calculated. "Daniel, your mother and I have been talking. We think it would be best if you reconsidered your position." "I've already made my decision, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. Grandpa's will was clear. I'm not going to disrespect his wishes. There was a pause, and then the guilt-tripping began. "You know your sister is struggling. She doesn't have the same opportunities you do. Don't you think it's your responsibility to help her out? We're family." I could feel my frustration bubbling under the surface. "Dad, Emily has had every opportunity handed to her on a silver platter. She chose not to take them. That's not my fault. I've worked hard for everything I have, but he wouldn't let it go. You're being selfish, Daniel. You're putting money before family. We raised you better than this." I wanted to scream. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "I'm done being the scapegoat in this family. Grandpa wanted us to be treated equally. If you can't respect that, then that's your problem, not mine." I hung up before he could respond. The next few weeks were tense. My parents barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was through short, clipped messages. I heard from a few cousins that my dad had been complaining about me to the rest of the family, painting me as ungrateful and greedy. It hurt to know they were spreading lies about me, but I tried not to let it get to me. Then, things took a more serious turn. One evening, I got a call from my grandmother, my grandfather's widow. She was furious. "Daniel, I just got off the phone with your father. He's trying to take control of your inheritance. He's claiming that your grandfather would have wanted Emily to have your share." My stomach dropped. "Can he do that?" "No," she said firmly. "He's the executor of the will, but he doesn't have the authority to change it. Your grandfather made his wishes very clear, but that's not stopping your father from trying." I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. My dad was willing to go to such lengths to take what was rightfully mine and give it to Emily. It was infuriating. "What can I do?" I asked. "I don't want to cause more drama, but I'm not going to let them steal my inheritance." "I've already spoken to the family lawyer," my grandmother said. "He's prepared to intervene if necessary, but I want you to be ready. Your father isn't going to back down easily." I thanked her and hung up, feeling both grateful and overwhelmed. It was comforting to know I had someone on my side, but the thought of a legal battle with my own parents was exhausting. The next day, I called a lawyer to get a second opinion. He confirmed what my grandmother had said. My dad couldn't legally take my share of the inheritance. If he tried, I had every right to fight it in court, but the idea of going to court against my parents was heartbreaking. I didn't want things to escalate that far. I just wanted them to respect my boundaries. Unfortunately, that wasn't in the cards. A week later, I got a message from my mom. It was long and emotional, filled with guilt-tripping and accusations. She claimed that I was tearing the family apart, that I was putting money above relationships, and that I didn't care about my sister's well-being. "Emily needs that money more than you do," she wrote. "She's struggling to make ends meet. You're doing fine on your own. Why can't you just help your sister?" I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say that would change their minds. They had decided long ago that Emily's needs were more important than mine, and no amount of reasoning would make them see otherwise. The final straw came when my dad announced that he was planning to give my entire share of the inheritance to Emily. He claimed that it was what Grandpa would have wanted, despite the fact that the will said otherwise. I knew I couldn't let that happen. I called my grandmother and told her everything. She was livid. "That's not what your grandfather wanted," she said. "He made it very clear that all of his grandchildren should be treated equally. Your father has no right to change that." Together, we decided to take action. My grandmother contacted the other executor of the will, a family lawyer, and they stepped in to ensure that my dad couldn't tamper with the inheritance. The backlash from my parents was immediate. "How could you do this to us?" my mom cried over the phone. "You're turning the family against us." "I'm not turning anyone against you," I said calmly. "I'm just standing up for myself. I have every right to my share of the inheritance." But they didn't see it that way. To them, I was the villain. I was the selfish son who refused to help his struggling sister. I was the one who was breaking the family apart. It hurt. No matter how much I tried to tell myself that I was doing the right thing, their words still stung. A part of me still wanted their approval, still longed for their love, but I knew I couldn't give in. I had spent my entire life putting their needs before my own. It was time to put myself first. The situation reached a boiling point at a family gathering. My aunt was hosting a dinner, and my parents showed up uninvited. They immediately started causing a scene, shouting about how I had betrayed the family. "You've always been ungrateful," my dad said, his voice shaking with anger. "We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us?" I stood my ground. "You didn't give me everything. I worked hard for what I have. Grandpa saw that, and he wanted me to have my share. You can't take that away from me." My mom started crying, and my dad stormed out of the room. The rest of the family sat in awkward silence, unsure of what to say, but my grandmother spoke up. "Daniel is right," she said firmly. "Your father has always favored Emily, and it's time we acknowledge that. This isn't about money, it's about fairness." Hearing her say those words was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time, someone in my family was standing up for me. After that night, things started to shift. My dad's siblings rallied behind me, refusing to let him manipulate the situation any further. The will was executed as my grandfather intended, and I received my full share of the inheritance. But the damage to my relationship with my parents was done. They accused me of tearing the family apart. They claimed I had turned everyone against them. My dad even threatened to cut me out of their will completely. At that point, I realized something important. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their validation. I had spent my entire life chasing something I was never going to get. And for the first time, I was okay with that. After the showdown at my aunt's dinner, I knew there was no going back. My parents' reaction had been explosive, their anger palpable. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't crumbling under the weight of their expectations. Instead, I felt a sense of freedom. The following week, my mom called me again. Her voice was softer than before, but I could sense the underlying tension. "Daniel, we need to talk," she said. "We can't let this tear the family apart." I sighed. "Mom, I've already explained my position. There's nothing more to say." "But you don't understand," she insisted. "Your father is struggling with this. He feels betrayed. We never expected you to turn against us." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Even after everything, a part of me still wanted to believe that my parents cared about me, that they loved me equally. But I knew better now. Their love had always been conditional, tied to how well I played my role in the family. "I'm not turning against you," I said firmly. "I'm standing up for myself. There's a difference." She didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with resignation. "Your father doesn't see it that way. He thinks you're trying to hurt us." I wanted to scream, to shake her out of her delusion, but I kept my composure. "Mom, This isn't about hurting anyone. It's about fairness. Grandpa wanted us all to be treated equally. I'm honoring his wishes. Why can't you see that? Her silence was deafening. The weeks that followed were tense. My parents stopped reaching out, and the cold silence between us grew thicker with each passing day. Meanwhile, I leaned on my grandmother for support. She became my rock during this tumultuous time, always reminding me that I was doing the right thing. One afternoon, we met for coffee at a small cafe near her house. She brought a worn leather scrapbook with her, placing it gently on the table between us. "What's this?" I asked, curious. "Something your grandfather kept," she said with a smile. "I think it's time you saw it." I opened the scrapbook, my fingers tracing the yellowed pages. Inside were clippings of my achievements, school awards, newspaper articles, photos of me at various events. There were even copies of my college acceptance letters. "He was proud of you, Daniel," my grandmother said softly. "He always was. He just didn't know how to show it in front of your parents." My chest tightened with emotion. All those years, I had believed that no one in my family truly saw me, but here was proof that my grandfather had noticed my hard work, even if he hadn't always voiced it. "Thank you," I whispered, blinking back tears. "This means more to me than you know." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You deserve to know the truth. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're less than." Despite my grandmother's support, the tension with my parents continued to escalate. They refused to attend any family gatherings if I was present, and my dad's siblings grew increasingly frustrated with his behavior. One evening, my aunt called me. "We've had enough," she said bluntly. "Your parents can't keep holding the family hostage like this. We're all tired of it." Her words gave me a sense of validation. For years, I had been made to feel like the problem, the one who caused tension and drama. But now, it was clear that my parents' actions were the root cause. A few days later, my mom sent me a long email. It was filled with guilt-tripping and emotional manipulation, accusing me of breaking the family apart. She claimed that my refusal to give up my inheritance was proof that I didn't care about them. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Then, out of the blue, my sister Emily reached out. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I was surprised. Emily had stayed silent throughout the whole ordeal, never once taking a stand. I wasn't sure what to expect. We met at a park near my house. She looked nervous, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, "about everything that's happened, and I realized something. I've been part of the problem." Her words caught me off guard. "I never stood up for you," she continued. "I let Mom and Dad's favoritism go unchecked because it benefited me, and that wasn't fair. I'm sorry." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to be angry, to demand why she hadn't spoken up sooner, but another part of me was relieved to finally hear her acknowledge the truth. "It's not just about the inheritance," I said slowly. "It's about years of feeling like I didn't matter, like I was invisible." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know, and I want to make it right. I'm going back to school with my share of the inheritance. I'm going to try to build a life for myself without relying on Mom and Dad." Her words filled me with a mix of emotions, pride, hope, and a lingering sadness for all the years we had lost. "I'm glad you're taking this step," I said, "but it's going to take time to rebuild our relationship." "I understand," she said softly. "I just hope we can get there someday." For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope for our future as siblings. As for my parents, they continued to dig their heels in. My dad refused to admit any wrongdoing, insisting that I was the one tearing the family apart. He even threatened to disinherit me from their will entirely, but I didn't care anymore. I had spent too much of my life chasing their approval, trying to be the perfect son. Now, I'm done. I was building a life for myself, one that wasn't defined by their expectations or their approval, and for the first time, I felt truly free. After my parents' failed attempt to take my inheritance, things in the family started to unravel. It wasn't just about the money anymore. The tension between us grew unbearable. My father, still furious over the situation, kept blaming me for destroying the family. His words felt like daggers, accusing me of betraying them, when all I had done was fight for what was rightfully mine. He even went as far as threatening to remove me from his will entirely, trying to use the only power he had left over me. It stung, but at the same time, it was a wake-up call that showed me just how much he had always put money and control above genuine family bonds. My mother, on the other hand, was beginning to come to terms with her mistakes. Slowly, she started realizing that her favoritism and the way she had treated me for years weren't just affecting me, but the entire family. She began attending therapy, trying to confront the deep-rooted issues she had been ignoring for so long. It was a small step, but it meant a lot to me. She reached out, trying to heal the rift between us, but it was complicated. She had hurt me too deeply, and though I could see she was trying, there was still a part of me that couldn't forget how she had let me suffer in silence for all those years. Then there was Emily. She was the one I had thought I could never count on. After all, she had always been my parents' golden child, the one who could do no wrong. But something changed in her after everything came to light. Emily started seeing the unfairness in the way our parents had treated me, and it shook her to the core. One afternoon, we had a long conversation, and she told me about how she had finally spoken to our grandmother about everything, the favoritism, the manipulation, and the way our parents had shielded her from the truth. That conversation with Grandma had changed her perspective. Emily realized how wrong our parents had been, and it opened her eyes to how I had been pushed aside for so long. For the first time, she apologized for not standing up for me earlier. It wasn't much, but it was the first real sign of empathy I had ever seen from her. Slowly, Emily began to change. She enrolled in community college, wanting to build her own future, independent of the family. It was a huge step for her, and one that I respected deeply. I had always seen her as someone trapped in the cycle of dependency, but now she was starting to break free. Our relationship, which had been strained for so long, began to heal. We still had a lot of work to do, but it was different now. Emily was becoming the person I had always hoped she could be, someone who understood the pain I had gone through and was willing to make amends. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was progress, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had a chance at rebuilding the bond we had lost. As for my parents, things were still a mess. My father refused to admit any fault, and his refusal to attend family gatherings only widened the gap between us. It became clear to me that no matter how much I tried, I couldn't force him to change. He was stuck in his ways, and I had to accept that. But what mattered most was that Emily and I were finding a way forward. I used the inheritance money to create the life I had always wanted. I invested in my future, helping Emily get an education and start her own life, separate from the shadows of our parents. I realized that the love and support I had been searching for my whole life didn't have to come from my parents. I could find it in the people who truly cared about me, and in the end, I learned to value myself for who I was, not based on my family's approval or their version of success. Family wasn't just about blood, it was about the people who lift you up, who truly see you for who you are, and who support you unconditionally. The road to healing was far from simple, but as the months passed, I started to realize that I no longer needed my parents' approval to feel complete. It took me years to get to this point, but I had finally found peace within myself, something I never thought would be possible after everything that happened. The family I had always longed for wasn't going to come from my parents. It was going to come from me. Emily and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't happen overnight, but there was a deep understanding between us now. After everything had come to light, she had begun to change. She was starting to see the manipulation for what it was, and slowly, she began making choices that weren't influenced by our parents. I could see that she was trying to be more independent, and I was proud of her. The most surprising part was that she apologized to me, something I had never expected. She admitted how much she had taken our parents' side for years, and I realized she had been as much a victim of their favoritism as I was. We began to talk more openly, and with time, I started to trust her again. My parents, however, remained a complicated issue. My mother was trying, really trying. She attended therapy, began to acknowledge the wrongs of her past, and even reached out to me. It felt like a small but important step forward, but I wasn't ready to let her back in fully. I had learned that it wasn't enough to apologize for past mistakes. Rebuilding trust takes time, and I needed more than words to feel secure. I appreciated her efforts, but I was still cautious. As for my father, I could see no change in him. He refused to admit his faults, and his stubbornness only pushed me further away. He still tried to use his money and control as a way to manipulate me, but I had grown stronger. I stopped seeking his approval, and the weight of his constant rejection no longer carried the same sting. I realized that no matter how much I wanted him to change, it wasn't my responsibility to fix him. I decided to use the inheritance to build a future that was mine. It was a symbolic act, something I needed to do for myself. I paid off my debts, secured investments, and started laying the groundwork for the life I had always wanted. I also used part of the money to support Emily's education. Watching her make decisions for herself was a reminder of how far both of us had come. We weren't the same people we were a year ago, and that was a good thing. The healing wasn't just about the money. It was about finding a sense of freedom. Freedom from the toxic hold my parents had on me. I realized that my worth didn't come from their approval or recognition. My worth was mine to define. I learned to set boundaries, not just with my parents, but with everyone who had ever tried to diminish me. I began to value myself in a way I never had before, and I didn't feel guilty about it. I stopped waiting for my father's approval. I stopped hoping for the kind of family dynamic I had always dreamed of. Instead, I built a new kind of family with the people who truly cared about me, those who supported me, those who saw me for who I really was, and those who never tried to manipulate me into a role I didn't want. In the end, I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, the people who respect you, and the people who make you feel safe. I found that love and support from the most unexpected places, and that made all the difference. My parents may never fully change, but I could still create a life of my own. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had my own back, and that was more than enough. Looking back, I could see how far I had come. The pain of my past no longer defined me. I wasn't just the child they overlooked anymore. I was someone who had learned to thrive despite them, and that to me was the true victory.